I had the coolest job that any electrical engineer could ever have on the ground crew for Solar Impulse 2, the first solar-powered airplane to fly around the world only using the power of the sun. IEEE USA has given me a competitive edge because of their support system. It is so much easier doing something and being out of your comfort zone when you have someone there saying, "You got this." IEEE USA is more than just a network. It's a family.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another IEEE USA Livestream webinar, CHIPS Act, a new era in U.S. semiconductors. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. IEEE USA's goal is to create programming that is valuable, relevant, and of interest to you. As such, we will be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event and would love your feedback. We appreciate we value your opinions and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and share your thoughts. Our presenters for today are IEEE members David Bondurant and Dr. Matt Francis. David Bondurant is a 50-year IEEE Life Senior member. He's developed computers that control data in UNIVAC in the 1970s, VHSIC semiconductor and computer-aided design technology at Honeywell in the 1980s, and advanced memory technologies in 1990s and 2000s at companies like Ramtron, Enhanced Memory Systems, Simtech, Freescale, and Everspin Technologies. In retirement, he volunteers with the IEEE and Computer Society, working with chapters and members around the world. Matt Francis, PhD, is founder and president CEO of Ozark Integrated Circuits Incorporated, where he leads development of high-temperature semiconductor computing solutions for energy, defense, aerospace, and space applications, and has served as a remote payload specialist for Ozark IC's payloads on the International Space Station. He coordinates complex semiconductors supply chains and serves in a number of advisory and elected roles within government and industry. Within IEEE, he serves as Region 5 Director-elect, as the IEEE USA representative to the IEEE Industry Engagement Committee, and in numerous committees within IEEE MGA. He's also an advisor to science-based startups throughout the Winrock International Science Venture Studio. Without further ado, I will now pass it off to our presenters. Welcome, gentlemen. We're very excited for what you have for our audience today.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Dave Bondurant, and we're going to talk about the CHIP Act, a new era in the U.S. semiconductor, and kind of answer these questions for you. How did the semiconductor and computer industry develop over the last 50 years? How has the global industrial competition shaped these industries? What industry trends have led to the CHIP Act? What is the CHIP Act? And what are the pieces of the CHIP Act that can revitalize the U.S. semiconductor industry and maintain our computer leadership? So we're going to start with the fundamental device, the transistor, and which kind of launched the semiconductor industry back in 1947. And so you can see that the transistor was invented at Bell Labs in 1947. It's a solid state replacement for tubes based on the materials of semiconductor materials. Shockley of the founding team created a thing called Shockley Semiconductor Labs in the Silicon Valley in 1956. So kind of launched the manufacturing of transistors in Silicon Valley. There were a group of 8 scientists that he recruited. They're called the Traitorous 8 from Shockley that left to form Fairchild Semiconductor in 1957. You can kind of see those guys over on the right. They're the kind of the pioneers and founders of Silicon Valley. And of course, the comment on the top is basically a reference to the fact that with the death of Gordon Moore fairly recently, it was essentially the end of that semiconductor era, since I believe all those people are no longer with us. But just to point out a few key people there, you can see a guy named Eugene Kleiner. And he later became a key venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. Robert Noyce was the president of Fairchild, and of course one of the founders of Intel later. Over on the right is Gordon Moore. He was the vice president of R&D for Fairchild. And over on the right is Gene Horney. He was basically the developer of the planar transistor. And then finally, Jay Last was the head of the integrated circuit development group at Fairchild. And so basically, they started developing transistors in 1957. And these discrete transistors were used in computers throughout the 1950s and in the 1960s. So now what we're going to do is kind of balance between some Seymour is the father of supercomputing. He joined ERA Associates in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1950. He designed one of the first transistor computers, Transtech, in 1951. So clearly, 4 years after the invention of the transistor, Seymour is starting the development of the first transistor computer. He designs a thing called ERA Atlas II, which will become UNIVAC 1103 in 1954. ERA basically is acquired by Remington Rand in 1952 and later by Sperry, and they become Sperry UNIVAC. Now, Seymour hangs around at UNIVAC for a couple of years, but he ultimately forms Control Data Corporation in 1950. Other ERA founder, William Norris. And he then proceeds to design a series of supercomputers using discrete transistors from 1960 to 1972. At that point, he forms Cray Research. And of course, the rest is kind of history. He, in 1997, the Computer Society of the IEEE created the Seymour Cray Computer Engineering Award to honor high-performance computer creativity. And so you can see a couple of comments that we're going to come back and talk about later from Seymour Cray. He says, as long as we can make them smaller, we can make them faster. Now, in Seymour's time, making them smaller was to shrink the packaging and pack the transistors tighter on a PC board. But of course, that's going to have a broader meaning in a little while. The other thing is 2 oxen or 1,000 chickens. That was basically his comment that he prefers the higher performance, a higher performance CPU, in other words, the fastest you can build, rather than using a bunch of low performance computers to accomplish the goal. We'll review that again later as well. Okay, so basically the people at Fairchild invent the integrated circuit. And so Robert Noyce of Fairchild is patented the first monolithic integrated circuit in 1958. You can kind of see a picture of him. Now, it was not without controversy. And so another guy named Jack Kilby of TI patented something like that at the same time. And so after a legal battle, basically a monolithic integrated circuit, but Kilby wins the Nobel Prize for the same. Fairchild built the first production resistor transistor logic IC in 1961. And so you can see a picture of the first RTL IC down there on the bottom. And so that particular logic device was used, and again, this is the early 60s, and so we're going to the moon. And so it's used on the Apollo guidance computer in flies in space. During the 1960s, integrated circuits for most logic families for computers were developed. And so you can see ECL, DTL, TTL, and CMOS, all very familiar types of logic that were developed in the 60s. And so this SSI integrated circuits were used in the 60s and in the 70s to build computers. Okay, well, I think you probably heard of Gordon Moore of Fairchild. and Moore's law, which relates to the IC transistor count. He basically observed the number of transistors per chip was doubling every 2 years by 1965. And so over on the right is his graph showing the doubling of transistors. And you can see down below pictures of the, on the upper left, a planar transistor, the first integrated circuit, and then growing complexity of the integrated circuit over those first few years. And so as he plots that, he observes that trend. And so Carver Mead of Caltech popularized the term Moore's law in 1975. Semiconductor industry transistor growth and economics over the entire 50-year period. Okay, so briefly we'll talk about scaling. Basically, what semiconductors is about is basically the ability to build more and more transistors on an integrated circuit. And so scaling has occurred since 10 microns feature size in 1971, and it continued to scale all the way to 3 nanometers in 2022. So this shrinking of transistors has allowed more transistors or allowed chips to grow from 3,000 transistors in 1971 to more than 60 billion transistors in the Apple M2 Max microprocessor using 5 nanometer technology in 2022. Trend on the right. Now, the semiconductor industry developed committees to kind of develop a roadmap and follow this Moore's law scaling and forecast the future. And so you can see that from 1997 to 2007, there was a group called the National Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors. 2007 to 2015, the International Technology Roadmap of Semiconductors. And then starting in 2016, the IEEE has developed a thing called the International Roadmap of Devices and Systems. And so that's what's been guiding this roadmap. Now, we're not going to talk today a lot about the semiconductor process and how we went about going from 10 micrometers down to 3 nanometers over that time period. Talk, and that occurred last week. So I would recommend the talk by Kathy Hayashi, Semiconductors and Introduction, and you can see the Zoom link on YouTube for that. And so today's talk is going to focus more about the interaction of semiconductor devices and packaging to build computers over the last 50 years. Okay, I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of my history in here so to give you some perspective on what was happening at the time. And so I come out of Missouri University in Rolla in 1971. And so summer of 1971, I arrived in the Twin Cities area, Arden Hills, the Control Data Arden Hills Development Center. That's my first job. At the time, the Control Data fastest computer in the world in production. It's built out of discrete transistors. Seymour Cray, who is the architect of these machines, is in Chippewa Falls, developing the CDC 8600 out of discrete transistors. I'm assigned to the memory development group and to design the first DRAM module for a control data supercomputer. Because I'm fresh out of school, I'm not going to be designing that DRAM module personally. My job is on the team is basically to design a DRAM module tester for, out of ECL SSI logic. And so basically at that time in history, Control Data was just designing ECL SSI logic into the STAR vector computer, which is another supercomputer that was being developed at the time. And so I used that logic to design that module tester. Now we used a thing called the 7001, the first 1 kilobit PMOS that was produced in 1969. So it was kind of the first DRAM. It operated at 15 volts. Of course, you know that Intel had the first commercially successful DRAM that launched in about the same year, 1971. But the thing that we had to work with at that time was the AMS 7001. That DRAM module basically had 128 chips on two 6x9 12-layer PC boards, and it was Freon cooled. So that was an exotic thing at the time, of course, to have Freon cooling. Its capacity, a very small 4K by 32 bits. And it required conversion on the board from PMOS to TTL to ECL. And so that's kind of the scenario. And that first chip is somewhere between 1 kilobit, 1K and 3K transistors that you see on the right. Okay, so during the 1960s through the 1980s, the US basically leads and dominates the semiconductor industry in the computer market. And so you can see some of the developments that occurred during that time period on this chart. The SRAM was developed in the 1960s by Fairchild. You can see the bipolar PROM, programmable read-only memory in 1969. That first DRAM. Along comes the first microprocessor from Intel, the 4004 and 8008 in 1971, and the first programmable UV programmable EEPROM in 1971. So these are the things that are kind of creating the microprocessor revolution. And you can see all kinds of circuit innovations during the 1970s. And so E-squared PROM, slice microprocessor, FPLAs, monolithic multiply adders, FPGAs, flash memory, MRAM, NAND flash, and FRAM all occurred in the 1970s and 80s. And so the US is at the top of the world at that time. Now, what am I doing at that time? I basically had left Control Data after 1 year. Same time as Seymour Cray, went and founded Cray Research. About 2,000 people were laid off in the Twin Cities. I didn't get laid off, but I was kind of not going to end up where I wanted to be. And so I end up at Sperry Univac across town. And so I'm developing computers at Univac and Robert Shaw Controls during the 1970s. And so the purpose of this chart is really to show you what computers looked like in the 70s. And so my first microprogram controller, they would call it, for the Trident navigation system demo. And so we're developing kind of the concept for the Trident navigation computer, which is the nuclear submarine. And we build it out of TTL, small scale and medium scale integrated circuit chips, and bipolar PROM. The bipolar PROM was the first programmable memory that allows us to write microcode and create the microprogrammable controller. And then after that, I basically went on to develop and work on a packet and circuit switch for a thing called MikadoNet. It was an early form of the internet. And again, out of TTL small scale circuits. I basically left Univac and went to Robert Shaw Controls right at a crucial time. In 1970, basically the microprocessor is first appearing in the marketplace in a broad scale. And so I developed both oven controls for the Robert Shaw Lux time division out of a 4-bit microprocessor from Rockwell, and then building controls out of an 8-bit microprocessor from Motorola for about a year. And so it was a very exciting time, a chance to get hands-on the microprocessor that was just emerging and being produced for the first time. I go back to Univac and work on things like the B1 avionics computer and a 1553 multiplex I/O system, again using small-scale integrated circuits and FPLAs, which are a new programmable logic device that had just come out. And then finally, I end up on a Sony parallel processor having 16 processors in parallel. And so you can see an example of that type of circuit board that was common at the end of the 1970s. Basically small scale integrated circuits, but with monolithic multiply adders and FPLA devices. And basically that thing executed fast Fourier transforms as an instruction. And then finally in 1978, I bought my first PC, which was an Apple II. And so it was an 8-bit microprocessor with a 16 kilobit DRAM. And so that's kind of a overview of what happened in the 1970s. Okay, so what's happening around the world? Well, Japan is observing and basically importing semiconductors for the US for their local consumer industry. Their industry coalition basically begins a program called VLSI Project in 1975. And so they bring together, 5 major corporations in Japan and invest $300 million. They develop a 64 kilobit DRAM at the same time as the US, but with better quality and yield. And so by 1985, Japan has been able to drive the US DRAM manufacturers from the market with their superior product. And so you can see that their market share has grown to over 50% by that point. And at this point, only Micron is still manufacturing DRAM in the United States. And so that's the impact of investment strategies by foreign competitors. United States do. They responded with a thing called the VISIC program, the Very High Speed Integrated Circuit program, which allowed them to regain leadership. And by the end of this decade, the Berlin Wall fell. And so what the U.S. did was invest in the VISIC program to the tune of $900 million over 10 years. 6 teams of companies, Honeywell, Hughes, IBM, TI, TRW, and Westinghouse developed the chips. Honeywell developed a 1.25 micron bipolar CMOS and radiation hard CMOS process by 1984. So that's a VISIC process. And they created the first VISIC production facility in Colorado Springs in 1986. Now that's where I am today. That's how I ended up in Colorado Springs, is I'm in the 1980s developing this technology. And so Honeywell used this VISIC technology for their mainframes, the Honeywell DPS 7 and 8, and ETA Systems, a supercomputer company that's associated with Control Data, developed an ETA 10 in 1988 with that technology. And so the ETA 10 supercomputer is the world's first CMOS and only cryogenically cooled supercomputer. It was the fastest computer in the world in 1988. And so that's the implication of the US entering and investing money in this new technology. Now, at the same time that Japan is jumping into semiconductors, their computer industry is entering the market as well. And so Control Data in 1981 had basically competing with is competing with them. And then three other Japanese companies are also entering the market with supercomputers. And so they need a leap forward. And so they select Honeywell's VISIC CMOS technology. I was working on that CMOS VISIC technology at that time. And so I worked with them and they build the world's first CMOS and only cryogenically cooled supercomputer using that technology. And so, as I said, I'm the VISIC System Application Manager at Honeywell. I provide the technology. They actually designed the gate array and the packaging using the technology we had developed for the VISIC program. And so you can see the gate array and the unique tab or tape automated bonding And so that allowed CDC to integrate and build the first single board CPU that has 128 of these chips on one PC board, and submerge that in liquid nitrogen to make it operate at about twice the speed, and build a system with up to 8 CPUs at that time. Okay, so what's happening at the same time that this is happening? Korea decides that they want to get into the game, and so the Korean cabals, as they call them, Samsung, LG, and Hyundai, basically self-fund their entry to the market. So it's not really a government-sponsored thing. It's basically driven by large corporations. They license technology from Zytex in the US and a design from Micron, and produce their first DRAM in Korea. You see in the chart on the right. What's interesting is the guy I was working with at Honeywell, a guy named Jun Lee, and he was the head of the Honeywell VISIC CMOS process development. He basically went home in 1984 and ends up heading the Samsung process development group. Samsung proceeds to license a 256 kilobit DRAM and produce it in 1984, and then bring up their own process and design by 1986, when they delivered a 1 megabit DRAM. And so you can see that they are rapidly catching up with the industry. And so by 1993, Samsung is the world leader in DRAM technology and revenue. By 1993, Hyundai is the number 2 DRAM supplier in the world. And by 1999, Hyundai, which is the ongoing company. I also mentioned here that Korea is licensing NAND flash technology. It's being developed by Toshiba in 1992, and they introduced their first NAND flash device in 1994. By 2002, they're the world leader in NAND flash with 54% market share. And by 2022, both Samsung and SK Hynix are the top 2 suppliers in the world with $96 billion in revenue. And so they're the world leaders in memory. Enter a third global competitor, Taiwan. Basically, starting in 1987, Morris Chang has formed TSMC with an investment from Philips Corporation. He creates a foundry business model of selling to fabless semiconductor companies, which is kind of a first. And TSMC and UMC become the world leaders in foundry by 2002 with a total of 40 fabs, at their control. Taiwan foundry business grows rapidly as they gain support of notable companies such as Apple, Qualcomm, AMD, NVIDIA, and Xilinx in the United States. And their revenue grew to $74.6 billion by 2022. TSMC and UMC have the two largest foundry companies in the world. And TSMC is the first company to use extreme ultraviolet lithography at the 7 and 5 nanometer feature sizes. And so you can see the next generation TSMC fab at a science park in Taiwan at 3 nanometers, and the advanced fab Taiwan's become basically the technical leader in logic process. Now, what am I doing at this time? Basically, I have moved from Honeywell, and I become the director of marketing of Ramtron and a company called Enhanced Memory in Colorado Springs in the 1990s. And so I had the benefit of working with one of those companies that was driven out of the market by the Japanese. The company was called Inmos Corporation, and their design team basically ended up at Ramtron. And so they developed the fastest DRAM technology at that time. that ran at 60 nanoseconds in cycle time. And we at Ramtron basically developed a thing called the enhanced DRAM by combining fast DRAM and SRAM all on one chip. And so by the end of the 1990s, we were partnering with Hewlett-Packard to develop a 72 megabit DDR ESRAM product as an L2 cache for the PA RISC microprocessor. And so you can see the announcement of that microprocessor in 2001 at the Microprocessor Forum. This would kind of foretell some of the packaging technology that's coming forward. And so what you see on that block diagram at the right is a microprocessor with dual CPUs, large L1 caches, and an interface that goes off to 4 of these ESRAM chips that are mounted in clamshell form on BGA packages. And so there's chips mounted front and back, a total of 4 chips to provide the cache for that CPU. What does all this mean? Well, basically, Moore's law is taking over. As you recall, Seymour Cray said, if we make it smaller, we'll make it faster. And that was, in fact, the case. Intel had launched their 8386 microprocessor in 1985. So that was really one of the first commercial microprocessors to hit the mainstream, if you will, in CMOS in 1985. Basically, CMOS is used for microprocessors and supercomputers ever since. And so you can see the trends in the microprocessor industry on the right. What you'll see is that we shrunk the transistor, and the clock rate kept increasing until it peaked at a little over 5 gigahertz in 2005, and then it leveled off. And so, the chips became power limited, and so we basically couldn't clock them any faster. We could make them smaller, but we couldn't clock them faster because of power. And since that time, performance increases with the number of processor cores. And so you recall Seymour liked a couple of strong oxen. By 2022, the chickens have won. Basically, lots of processor cores are what you need. Okay, so enter another party in the global competition, that's China. Basically, they developed a China Big Fund of $150 billion launched in 2014 to increase the amount of semiconductors manufactured in their country. China focused first on 5G wireless technology, and they've already become a leader in that technology. Now you can see the chart on the right. Still leads in the overall R&D in semiconductors, but both Korea and China are investing substantially more from their governments to close the gap. Okay, just one brief interlude on semiconductor process, and we'll be about done here. Basically, well, you might ask, why do wafer fabs cost $17 billion to build? And so I guess I didn't entirely know the answer to that. So I went to a talk by a guy named Dr. Lawrence Larson of the Central Texas IEEE. He's a former associate director of the front-end process development at Semitech, a U.S.-sponsored semiconductor development agency. This YouTube channel. I'm not going to go through that today, but here's a picture of the $17 billion 3-micron fab that's being built in Taylor, Texas. And as you'll see, it's being subsidized by CHIP Act funding. And so let's talk about some of the statistics. It's got 1,200 acres, 6 million square feet of clean room. It can process from 150 to 250,000 wafers per month. It uses deep EUV lithography that costs about $150 million for each piece of equipment. It has ion implantation machines of $5 million each. And to build that fab, there are anywhere from 80 to 180 of these tools that we talk about to support the volume. And there are a total of 1,200 employees in that factory. And so that's where the money's going. You can see the split of the money. It's $2 billion, the clean room close to $4 billion, and then the equipment is the $11 billion that make up the $17 billion in the facility. Now, why is it so hard? Well, transistors have gone from planar, like Gene Horney at Intel had developed back in the 1950s, to FinFET, which is a vertical transistor, to what's called gate-all-around. And so that is an increasingly vertical transistor that allows you to pack more transistors in a smaller space. The number of implant steps in the process has increased from just 1 or 2 to 9 or 10. The metal deposition processes have become complicated with things like copper and high K, and the number of metal layers have increased to 6 to 10 plus. The number of process steps have increased from, say, 10 to 15 in the early 70s to hundreds of steps today. Basically, the stakes in the semiconductor are so high. $17 billion is just more than a lot of companies are willing to spend. Okay, so where are we at today? Well, Moore's law is going to hit the scaling wall before 2034. And so process and packaging leadership is going to become strategic. It's going to require different approaches than simply shrinking the transistor. And so let's talk about a few of those techniques. One is called 2.5D heterogeneous integration of chiplets on silicon interposers. And so you can see the picture on the right. You can see that there's a silicon interposer mounted on the printed circuit board. You can see kind of the purple thing is the chiplet, a bunch of chips that are bumped and mounted on the silicon substrate. And then the other trend that's occurring is what's called 3D vertical integration of chips. And so you can see that if you will, a silicon interposer holds up multiple DRAM stacked on top of each other. And the same is true for flash memory. And so that's called vertical integration of chips. You can also vertically integrate the process on the chip. And so Micron's 232-layer NAND flash is a perfect example of stacking multiple layers of process to build 232 NAND storage cells vertically. And so that's the current state of the art there. The other thing we can do is just use bigger chips. And so wafer scale integration is going to show up. To vertically integrate DRAM, you're going to need things like higher dielectric constant DRAMs. I'm kind of familiar with that because we've been pitching that idea since the original ferroelectric RAM back in the 1980s at Ramtron. But today it's other materials that are being used for this. And then other non-volatile storage techniques such as ferroelectric, magnetoresistive, resistive, and nanotube devices are going to be required to build the non-volatile storage devices of the future. And then finally, of course, Matt, being an expert in this area, new substrates and devices, things like silicon carbide and gallium nitride are going to come to the fore. Okay, so just to give you a couple of examples before I leave, the Cray, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Cray Frontier supercomputer is the current world's fastest computer. and it uses 2.5 and 3D integration extensively. And so we're going to show you how that works. This computer has over 1 exaflop of processing power. It has literally 106,000 computer CPU cores. It has over 8 million GPUs. It's built with 7 nanometer feature size, so it's not even at the state of the art, because of course this was designed and built a few years ago and put in place by 2022. And it runs not at 5 gigahertz, but at 2.4 gigahertz clock speed. Here's what the CPU module looks like. And so you can see the fact that there are a total of 8 chiplets, which each contain 8 processors. These are AMD EPIC processor chiplets. And then in the middle is a cache and interconnect chip. And so this processor module is built with 7 nanosecond features, 2.4 gigahertz clock speed, total of 64 processors. It has 8 DDR memory channels. And so you can see the memory modules around the chip. And their bandwidth is 410 gigabytes per second. So that's quite a bit of bandwidth, but we'll see that it's never enough. And so, and then finally, the I/O for this device is 200 gigabit Ethernet. Okay, in addition to the CPUs, we have the GPUs. And so here is a picture of the 2nd generation Instinct GPU that's used in that processor. And so you can see examples of the silicon interposer in the middle of that picture. On that, you can see 2 large GPU chiplets that contain 13,000 cores, I would say. All of this stuff is running at 1 gigahertz with a ability to clock up to 1.7 gigahertz. And then you can see surrounding that what are called high bandwidth memory 2E die stacks. And so you remember the picture. They're stacking chips 8 high on top of each other and mounting them on the boards. And the memory bus that's coming out of each of those stacks is 1,024 bits wide. And so that's how we get the bandwidth. And so the total memory capacity of this module is 128 gigabytes stored on those 8 memory stacks. The total power of this module is 500 watts. That has to be cooled using liquid cooling. Okay, so where are we heading from here? Basically, just literally in the last month, AMD has announced the next generation of their Instinct GPU. If you look close on the picture on the right, the thing called chiplets, along with 8 other little chiplets stuck in between. And then it has the next generation high bandwidth memory called HBM3. This stack has a total of 12 24 gigabit DRAMs high. And so, and the memory bus continues at 1,024 bits wide per memory stack. And so the total memory capacity of this module is 192 gigabytes, and the bandwidth is 5.2 terabytes because the clock speed also increases. And so the point I'm making is the fastest computers in the world are using the Beyond More technology to increase their performance, and it's being used on the current and the next generation supercomputer being developed by the US, which is called El Capitan. And that's not to say that that's the only thing it's being used on. And so just to show a commercial application of this technology, we see the current Apple M2 microprocessors. And so you can see that on a similar silicon substrate, we mount a microprocessor with 5 nanometer features. And, you know, in this case, it's 1 die on the top and 2 die on the bottom. So those constitute the M2 Max that has 67 billion transistors, 12 cores, 38 GPUs, and then basically the Max has a total of 4 die stacks on the module connected closely to the processor, and a total of 400 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. And so what that tells you is these are not high bandwidth memory modules. These are more standard DRAMs that are stacked than it is like the very high bandwidth memories. But the price is lower. And so that's the trade-off. And so then you can see that the M2 Ultra basically combines 2 chiplets and 8 die stacks to get to the 132 gigabyte memory capacity and 800 gigabytes of bandwidth. And so basically we don't have the luxury in these high performance computers anymore of having external memory modules. Everything has gone vertical. Okay, so, and then finally, just one example of wafer scale integration. And so a company called Cerberus has built a couple of generations of AI processor. This one at 7 nanometers that has over 850,000 AI cores on one chip. Here, instead of the vertical stacks, we have integrated embedded SRAM memory, which has higher speeds because it's on chip. And so the total memory bandwidth of this system is 20 petabytes per second, total of 2.6 trillion transistors, and it again is all water cooled. Okay, to summarize my talk, basically I've kind of shown you where we've come from, starting with a 1,000 transistor DRAM back in 1971 to these very high density 67 billion transistor microprocessors, which have as many as 8 to as many as 1 million transistors per chip. Memory has basically grown from 1 kilobit to 24 gigabits per chip, and we're stacking as many as 12 of those vertically. Now, I come from the memory business, and so I'll point out that one of the whole system design these days is latency. And so latency has not dramatically improved in DRAM, and so that's one of the big bottlenecks in systems these days, and why you might go to wafer scale integration. You can see that the width of the DRAM has gone wider, and you can see that the NAND flash, through its use of 3D integration on the chip, has gotten all the way from 4 megabit to 1 terabit per chip. So the bottom line is that we've hit the limit of scaling, and so new vertical processes, substrates, and material are required in the future. So that's my story, and I will turn it over to Matt at this time.
Thanks, David. So I think David did a great job giving us the context of how we got here and why the U.S. decided to respond to the semiconductor challenge with the creating helpful incentives for producing semiconductors, or CHIPS and Science Act, as it's known. But CHIPS is a very unique piece of legislation, and some of the things that David mentioned, this isn't the first time the U.S. has been seen a challenge and responded, but this time the challenge is very daunting from the perspective that we're not just going along Moore's law, we're beyond Moore. And so the CHIPS Act was designed, in fact, to address the beyond Moore challenges and keep the U.S. competitive. And so the CHIPS Act is really not just designed to fill the immediate supply chain gaps that were exposed primarily during the pandemic, but it really is designed to establish U.S. capacity to stay at the forefront of semiconductors, and just as importantly, to grow workforce. And so you'll see that, and you see this. These are in the points here, is that we need this workforce not just for semiconductors, but really for all STEM fields. And this is one of the things that I get asked a lot. for those who aren't directly in the semiconductor industry, why do I care about the CHIPS Act? I was like, well, every company, every technology company is a tech company now because of semiconductors. And furthermore, every tech company needs a lot of the same kind of workforce that we need for semiconductors. Next slide. So one of the aspects of IEEE USA that I think a lot of people don't know is really how amazing and how much work we do in legislative outreach. And so as the pieces of legislation that got created in the House and Senate in 2021 and 2022 evolved, IEEE USA was heavily involved in getting our members and industry leaders in front of the right people on those committees to make sure they understood what the challenge was. And so the incentives in the CHIPS Act are the first part that you probably have heard about. So, you've probably heard the number 39 billion. You might have heard 52 billion. It depends on if they're including the semiconductor institutes that we'll get into in a minute. But these are manufacturing incentives that attract not just leading edge facilities. So this is like the 2 and 3 nanometer facilities that David was talking about, but also there are big announcements in other places around things about beyond more techniques like chip stacking and advanced packaging. And so we're seeing big announcements around the country from places like Arizona, Texas, and Ohio. Those are those leading edge facilities. But we're also seeing that there's funding for mature nodes. These are a lot of the analog and mixed signal conversion technologies, actuation technologies that drive things like our cars and airplanes. And then also what NIST likes to call back-end, the packaging and testing of these components that make them usable in systems. CHIPS also funds the creation of several institutes, which are well underway. And we'll talk more about this later. But these institutes are really designed to drive R&D and workforce development to support the establishing more capacity here in the U.S., as well as sustaining that as the technology continues to evolve. Next slide. So, what does it fund? So 54 billion has been appropriated so far between the initiatives and the as well as the institutes and other EDA programs, depending on how you measure it. But the legislation actually authorizes. There's a difference between appropriation and authorizing. There's much more authorized, and so in the coming years, as I said, it'll be up to Congress to decide how much of this they appropriate. But this funding is intended to infuse everything from not just semiconductors, but also technologies that keep us at the forefront of science. So fusion, nuclear science initiatives. There's development programs at the regional level we'll talk about through the Economic Development Administration. And all of these programs will need your support. They will affect all 50 states. IEEE USA has brought all our members had the opportunity to join through our Congressional Visits Day this spring. We had about 100 members attend from all over the country, and this is one of the key things that we were, getting in front of Congress and talking about, because there's still a lot to be done in the coming 4 years of the program. We're really just at the start. Next slide. So the other aspect that's been appropriated this year is starting the creation of these institutes. And so the institutes and centers enable industry and academia to stay at the forefront of research and translation of that research into efficient manufacturing. And so you'll see in here that things like advanced packaging are brought out to the forefront because, like as David mentioned, it's not simply just about making smaller transistors anymore. We've reached a lot of fundamental limits, and we're having to do some very creative things like creating high rises of chips connected together all in the same modular substrate. So where we are with this right now is that advisory boards are just now being formed. If you probably saw in the news, one of the recent boards being announced, who is going to sit on that, industry leaders. But these centers are envisioned to be an important part of not just the R&D sort of setting the direction of R&D at the national level, but they also will help drive workforce development for chips in the long run. Next slide. So where are we now? Chips is really, I like to say it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, but an awful lot has happened in the first year, and you might not have heard about much of this because these are some of the smaller programs as compared to the big initiative incentives that are funding things like these giant fabs. So ME Commons is one. This is Microelectronics Commons is a big portion of the defense part of the CHIPS Act. Defense needs actually was one of the things that initially drove the need for the CHIPS Act. The defense industry has been sort of jumping up and down and screaming that we need capacity in the U.S. to make chips for defense applications. And so the ME Commons hubs are one of those things that was addressed in the CHIPS Act. And those are really designed to address military supply chain and R&D needs. There's expected to be around 9 or 10 hubs. These have been proposed and are expected to be announced very soon. And they're designed where projects will flow through the hubs. Membership will be very broad-based, and members who could be at academia, companies, small and large businesses. They will be able to solicit for proposals through those hubs, and then use the capacity within that hub to manufacture prototypes that would eventually scale to production. NIST manufacturing initiatives. This is well underway, and this is a signature part of the legislation. The first proposals for leading edge technologies began at the end of March. Mature node and back end or packaging applications began on June 26. These are being accepted on a rolling basis, and companies or consortiums can apply. The initiatives must be backed up with local support. And this is one of the themes of the CHIPS Act. It really wants to drive not just supporting an individual business, but creating the whole ecosystem, all the way from how are they going to get the workers in the business, what jobs are they going to create, and then how it's going to feed into the local economy. And so you have to have state, county, or municipal support to be able to apply. But the federal part can be up to 35% of the cost of the project. And then R&D centers, initiatives for those are planned for this fall. And these are all taken on a rolling basis, so applications at this point on the active programs can be submitted at any time. Next slide. So over the last year, these initiatives have generated a lot of press releases and announcements, and this is probably the part of the CHIPS Act you're most familiar with if you're following the news. Fabs being announced in Ohio, fabs being announced in Texas, Arizona. But many of these are still pending approvals. They've submitted their applications and they're going through feedback processes. So the flagship projects really are just the leading edge. And we will see many more smaller back-end and non-silicon proposals popping up all over the country over the coming years. Next slide. So CHIPS is really about more than just semiconductors. In a way, it's changing the way we fund research and how we approach economic development in the technical age that we live in. These programs are really designed to support ecosystem development with stakeholders engaged and on board from the first day. Some of the examples of this include the Economic Development Agency. Just this summer, they've rolled out the Tech Hubs program, which seeks to designate about 20 strategically important technology hubs around the country in their first round. These could be in areas from anything from AI to machine learning, semiconductors, even disaster recovery. The Recompete program is rolling out this summer and targets economic growth and sustainability in economically distressed areas. One important piece is the National Science Foundation has seen dramatic changes enabled by the CHIPS Act. Their budgets increased significantly, authorized over the coming years. And the established program to stimulate competitive research, or EPSCoR for short, is being put at the forefront of making sure CHIPS enables gains around the entire country. There are 20 jurisdictions that are currently EPSCoR jurisdictions. They have there are 20 jurisdictions that have historically received a small portion of their federal R&D expenditures versus the rest of the country. And under the CHIPS Act, those 28 jurisdictions are now NSF's tasked with investing a third of their total budget in these states, as shown on the map. So the new technology and innovation partnership as well, the TIP, has been created, and that's driving use-inspired research with broader stakeholder engagement across disciplines. And there's over 200 million in workforce development that has been earmarked so far. And finally, DOE has been tasked with expanding its fundamental science portfolio, as well as basic energy research, funding everything from neutrinos to fusion, modular reactors, critical minerals, and geothermal energy research. Next slide. So how do you stay involved? So one of the great resources that you can use is chips.gov. As programs roll out, they are everything announced here, whether it's from NIST, NSF, EDA, any of the agencies involved is put here, and programs are posted here before they're formally announced, where there's a request for information phase. And so anybody, any citizen in the U.S. can respond to those RFI requests and give your perspective. And those of you who are technologists, and as many of us are in IEEE, I highly recommend that you pay attention to these and respond from your experience. If you're like me, you've noticed that young people are asking questions about semiconductors because it's in the news. And so one cool thing that IEEE's Tri-Engineering portal has done is put together this resource on their portal that gives you a tool for interested young people to find out what semiconductor careers would look like, whether it be from semiconductor manufacturing all the way to nanomaterials and other adjacent fields. Next slide. And finally, IEEE USA is really encouraging as well. We've seen this, that we're encouraging building broad coalitions across industry, government, and academia. And we're trying to take a lead in this by creating the first Innovation, Workforce, and Research Conference, or IWORK. This will be September 13th through 15th in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we're convening panels around different industry verticals in the region. This is in the Arkansas and Delta region. So we'll have panels on energy, aerospace, defense, agriculture, and other disruptive technologies. And the idea is that this format is going to travel around the country. So this will be the first, we hope, many IWORK conferences. And over these 5 years, we're going to be focusing these on how the CHIPS Act in particular can affect that region with positive outcomes. So with that, I think that concludes our talk on the sort of the history of the semiconductor industry in the U.S. that got us to this point, what the CHIPS Act is, what its current status is, and then for staying on top of that, I highly encourage following the IEEE USA webcasts on the government updates. They're fantastic up-to-the-minute news on what's moving through Congress, and a lot of it tends to be related to the CHIPS Act these days as things move through different budget stages. So, thank you.
All right, fantastic presentation, guys. Thank you so much. So, real quick, I know we've run a little bit over. Before we close up, we did have an audience member question that we would like to address. If either of you have any insights. So, our audience member is, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He says, first off, the CHIPS Act requires that applicants submit policies and procedures to combat cloning, counterfeiting, and relabeling of semiconductors. His follow-up question is, which industry or publicly defined standards should be used to measure the effectiveness of efforts to combat cloning, counterfeiting, or relabeling? Any insight? And either one of you can jump in to answer.
So that's a good question. I know a lot of that work has been, and those standards have been driven by by US DoD. I'm myself not positive if IEEE has probably does have some standards related to that. I would have to look into that, but it's a good question. But I definitely know that through if you look at the DoD side of the house, there's a lot of things published on procedures and processes for combating cloning and counterfeiting. David, do you have anything to add?
I don't have any comment on that, though. Thank you.
All right, Fayez, hopefully that answered your question. All right, well, folks, unfortunately, we are out of time now. David and Matt, thank you so much for joining us today and providing providing our audience your insight on everything that went into the CHIPS Act, the history, sense of history, and what it incorporates. Really appreciate having both of you on here today. And thank you. Oh,
no, it said thank you, and thank you to everybody who attended.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to our audience members for tuning in and for your great questions. If you found this webinar topic interesting, be sure to check out our other upcoming events in the Talking Tech series, sponsored by IEEE USA and the Center of Excellence in Wireless and Information Technology at Stony Brook University. Before we end it off, I would like to bring in a special guest, our 2023 IEEE USA President, Ed Palacio, for some closing remarks. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you. I'm truly, I hope that all found these talks as interesting as I did. And so thank you, David. Thank you, Matt. For us, we believe that this is a way for us to bring value to the membership and to the profession at large. So we are now committed to providing these types of webinars on a pretty periodic basis. So stay tuned. We're going to do quite a lot of these. The last thing I want to say is Matt's position, and this IWRC conference is truly, truly important for us. We believe that this is an area that we as the Institute, and specifically we as IEEE USA, bringing out a lot of value. Here is an event where we're bringing academia, industry, government together to deal with something that's truly important. So we're looking to do this type of event in multiple places. We are going to learn from the first one. Matt is leading this event, and he's, we're going to find out, are we really bringing value? But I believe we are. And if such, we'll do many more of these. And so this is important for us. I think this is a way for us to truly engage and bring value to the profession and the community. So again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the talk, and you'll see more of this from us. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gray. Thanks so much, Ed. And folks, I've added the link to the iWork conference in both the comment section as well as the tab screen below. Be sure to check it out. It will be held in September 13th through the 15th of this year. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channels on social media, and check back daily for future live stream updates. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.